The candles had been lit 2 hours before any carriage was due, and that was the first thing the servants of Harrogate would remember when they spoke of the night for the rest of their lives. 300 of them. Beeswax, not tallow. Arranged down a dining table laid for 11 in a hall built to seat 60, so that the empty length of polished oak gleamed like a frozen river between the two clusters of place settings. The woman who had ordered them lit stood at the head of that table in a gown of unadorned gray silk, no jewels at her throat, no powder in her dark hair, and she watched the first lamps of the first carriage swing up the long drive through the November dark and did not move. To the county she was the cold Baroness. The phrase had followed her for 3 years. Since the night her husband had died in his study, with a glass of port unfinished at his elbow and a will that had startled everyone who heard it read. They called her cold, because she did not weep where they could see her, because she had paid her husband's debts to the last shilling instead of fleeing them, because she had refused 4 offers of marriage in 18 months and given no reason that satisfied a soul. Stay with me through this evening, because the woman they had decided to pity was about to teach an entire county what she had been doing in her silence. Eleanor Vane had invited to her table the 7 people in England who hated her most. She had not told them that, of course. The invitations had gone out in her own hand, cream paper and black ink, each one phrased as a gesture of reconciliation from a widow who wished to mend old quarrels before the worst of the winter closed the roads. She had written them at her late husband's desk over the course of a single gray afternoon, choosing each word the way a gardener chooses where to set a seed, and she had sanded the ink dry and sealed the wax, and handed them to a footman without a tremor in her hand. 6 had been accepted within the week. The 7th had not answered at all, and it was the 7th she watched for. Now the dark coat unfolding from the lead carriage into the lamplight. A tall man who looked up at the lit windows of Harrogate with the stillness of someone reading a letter he had not expected to receive. His name was Marcus Thorne, the Duke of Allerton, and he was the only guest at the feast who had never once spoken the word cold in connection with her, because he had never spoken of her at all. That was its own kind of verdict. He had cut her at the Pemberton ball the previous spring, turned his shoulder to her in a doorway with the whole room watching, and the county had taken it as proof. If Allerton would not acknowledge the Baroness of Harrogate, then the Baroness of Harrogate was not worth acknowledging. Eleanor had stood in that doorway with her face composed and her gloved hands steady on her fan, and only she had known that the steadiness cost her everything she had. She watched him climb the steps now, and she felt the old thing happen in her body before her mind could forbid it. A warmth rising at the back of her neck, a quickening she despised in herself, an awareness of exactly where he stood in the gravel court below, without her having to lean toward the window to find him. She had carried that awareness for 3 years, and told no one, least of all herself, most of the time. Tonight, she would need it gone. Tonight, she required her hands to be steady for a different reason, and she pressed them flat against the cool silk of her skirt, and breathed until the warmth retreated and only the cold purpose remained. The guests came up the staircase one by one, and the footmen took their cloaks, and Eleanor stood at the threshold of the great hall and greeted each of them by name. There was Sir Hugh Crane, broad and florid, in a coat too well cut for a country dinner, who held the mortgages on 2 of her tenant farms and had been quietly raising the rents past what the land could bear. There was the widow, Drummond, small and bird-quick, who had spread the story that Eleanor had poisoned her own husband, and had repeated it at every dinner table in 3 parishes. There was young Lord Farringdon, handsome and aggrieved, who had offered for her and been refused, and had told the clubs afterward that she was frigid and ungrateful and likely mad. There was her own cousin by marriage, Charles Vane, lean and watchful, who believed Harrogate should have come to him, and had spent 2 years contesting the will. There was the magistrate, Mr. Saltony, Pell, dry and careful, who had let the poisoning rumor reach the edge of an inquiry before letting it quietly drop, and who had never once told the county there was nothing in it. There was Lady Sutton, stiff with pearls, who ran the assemblies and had struck Eleanor's name from the subscription list. And there was Allerton, last, the man who had turned his shoulder. She greeted him. Exactly as she greeted the others, no warmer and no colder. And she watched something flicker behind his eyes at the evenness of it, as though he had braced for a reproach and been unsettled to receive none. He bowed over her hand and said only that it was good of her to ask him, and the words were stiff, and underneath the stiffness was something she did not have a name for. His glove was cool against her fingers. Her own pulse was not, and she was glad of the candlelight that hid the color. She could feel climbing her throat, and she held herself very still until he straightened. For one breath they stood near enough that she could have counted the gray threads at his temple, near enough that the warmth came back to her neck unbidden, and she despised the warmth, and could not stop it. And she turned from him before the moment could lengthen, and led her enemies into dinner. She seated them with deliberate care, the haters in a tight knot near the head of the table, and the Duke alone at the far foot, a wilderness of empty oak between him and the rest. The soup came. A clear consommé carried in by footmen who had been told to pour the claret freely, and to keep every glass filled to the brim. The conversation, at first, was the brittle social music of people who do not trust their hostess and cannot say so. Lady Sutton praised the candles in a voice that made the praise a question. Sir Hugh asked after the harvest with the false ease of a man calculating a debt. Eleanor, let it play. She sat very straight in her grey silk, and she answered what was asked of her, and she watched Sir Hugh's hand close around his wine-glass, and she watched Mrs. Drummond drink, and Charles drink, and Farrington drink, and she waited, because the thing she had built this evening around had not yet begun to work, and it would not be hurried. It began with Mrs. Drummond. The widow had taken 3 glasses of the Harrogate claret, a wine Eleanor had chosen with a care that none of them could have guessed at, and somewhere between the fish and the game she set down her fork, and said into a lull that she had always wondered whether the late Baron had truly died of his heart. There is a silence of the particular kind that falls when a guest says aloud the thing the whole table has been thinking. The footmen stood like statues against the wall. Eleanor did not flinch. She looked down the long, shining table at the woman who had tried to hang a murder on her for 3 years, and she said, in a voice without heat, that she had wondered the same, and that perhaps Mrs. Drummond, who had nursed her own late husband through his final illness, might tell them what a guilty conscience looked like at a deathbed. The widow's face changed. It was not a dramatic thing. It was the smallest collapse, a tremor at the mouth, a sudden brightness in the eyes. And then she was speaking, and she could not seem to stop. She told the table that she had given her husband the wrong tincture on the last night, that the doctor had said it made no difference, but she had never been sure, that she had lain awake for 9 years with the not knowing of it. She told them that she had spread the tale about Eleanor because, if the county was looking at the Baroness, it was not looking at her, that every time she repeated the story, she felt the weight of her own night lift a little, that she had built her peace on a stranger's ruin, and had known it, and had done it anyway. The words came out of her in a steady, helpless stream, and when they stopped, she sat with her hand pressed to her mouth, and her eyes wide, with the horror of having spoken. No one at the table moved. Down at the far foot the Duke of Allerton had gone very still, and he was watching Eleanor with an expression she could not read. Charles Vane laughed, the short, ugly laugh of a man who thinks he has seen a parlor trick. He said the wine had loosened the widow's tongue, and nothing more, that anyone might confess to anything, with enough claret in them, and that his cousin's famous coldness had finally curdled into theatrics. He lifted his own glass as he said it, a flourish, a man performing his contempt for an audience, and he drank deep to prove how little he feared her table. Eleanor watched him drink. She had been waiting for him to drink. She asked him pleasantly whether the documents he had filed against the will had been honest ones, and Charles Vane opened his mouth to deliver the practiced denial he had given a dozen courts. And what came out instead was the truth. He had forged a codicil. He said it plainly, helplessly, his own voice betraying him in front of the magistrate who sat 4 seats away. He had paid a clerk in Lincoln's Inn to draft a false page, leaving Harrogate to the mail line, He had meant to enter it after the original will was somehow lost. He had not managed to lose the original, because the Baroness kept it in a place he could not reach. He named the clerk. He named the sum, 40 guineas, and the tavern where it had changed hands. He heard himself say all of it, and his face went gray, and he gripped the edge of the table as though the floor of the room had tilted beneath him. The magistrate, Mr. Salak, Pell, set down his fork with a small, precise click that sounded very loud in the silence. "This is the part of the evening I have been waiting to tell you about, and I will only ask one thing of you before I go on. If a woman wronged by an entire county has ever stayed in your mind, leave a word below for Eleanor before the night turns, and then come back to the table, because the man at the foot of it has not yet said anything at all." Eleanor folded her hands, and the long candle-lit hall held its breath around her. She had learned about the wine from her husband. That was the thing none of them knew, and the thing she would not tell them tonight. The late Baron of Harrogate had been a quiet scholar of the old physic gardens, a collector of receipts and tinctures, a man who had spent the last years of his life among books that the county thought a waste of a title. He had been 30 years her senior, and she had married him without love and learned, slowly, to feel something better than love for him, a steady, companionable regard built over shared winters by the fire. In one of his books, copied in a 16th-century hand, there was a preparation of a flower that grew along the south wall of the Harrogate kitchen garden, a tall blue thing the gardeners called bishop's veil, which, when distilled and aged in wine for a full season, produced no drowsiness, no sickness, no visible sign at all, but only this loosening of the will to dissemble. A few hours in which the drinker found that the truth came more easily to the tongue than the lie. Her husband had thought it a curiosity. He had told her of it, the winter before he died, the two of them by the fire, with the wind in the chimney. And she had laughed and said it was a dangerous thing to leave in a book. And he had said that the only people who feared the truth were the people who had built their lives on its absence. She had not thought of it again until the morning after his funeral, when she had stood at the back of the church and heard a woman she had never wronged murmur to another that the young widow looked remarkably composed for a poisoner. The words had gone into her like a splinter and stayed. He had died of his heart, exactly as the doctor said, a quiet stopping in the night, with the port unfinished at his elbow. The county had decided otherwise, because a strange old man leaving a great house to a young wife, instead of to his own blood, was a thing they could not forgive, and a poisoning made a better story than a sad one. Eleanor had gone down to the kitchen garden in the first hard frost, 3 months after they buried him, and cut the tall blue flowers herself, with her own hands going numb in the cold, and carried them up to the still room, where her husband had kept his instruments, and she had begun, very quietly, to make the wine. It had taken a full season to age. She had told no one. She had paid the debts, and refused the suitors, and let them call her cold. And she had waited for the wine to be ready, and for the worst of the winter to close the roads, so that no one she invited could easily leave. And she had written her 7 invitations in her own careful hand. The Duke of Allerton had drunk nothing. She had noticed it across the length of the table, the full glass standing untouched at his place, the candlelight pooling red in it, and she did not know yet what it meant, only that the one confession she had half feared and half longed for was not going to come the way the others had. Sir Hugh Crane was speaking now, the words tumbling out of him before he could damn them. The rents he had raised past the law, the 2 families he had turned off their farms in the spring rain, with their children and their few sticks of furniture loaded on a borrowed cart. He confessed the letter he had written to a London bank, suggesting the Baroness was an unsafe debtor, in the hope of calling in her notes and buying Harrogate cheap. And he confessed that he had done it not from need, but from the simple pleasure of taking a thing from a woman who had no man to defend it. He pressed his napkin to his mouth as though he might be sick, and he could not stop the words, and the worst of it was the relief in his face beneath the horror, the relief of a man finally setting down a stone he had carried so long he had forgotten its weight. Lord Farringdon followed, his handsome face working, his voice cracking like a boy's. He confessed that she had refused him gently, more gently than he had deserved, that there had been no scorn in it, only a quiet, honest no. He confessed that he had ruined her name in the clubs out of nothing but the wound to his vanity. That he had invented the madness and the coldness over brandy with men who repeated it because it was amusing. That he had watched the rumor spread across a season and had felt, for the first time in his small life, that he could move the world and be feared in it, and had not cared at all what it cost her. He said there had been no madness in her, no coldness, only a woman who had said no to him and meant it, and that he had spent 18 months teaching 3 counties to despise her, for the crime of preferring her solitude to his hand. Lady Sutton wept as she spoke, the pearls trembling at her throat. She had struck Eleanor from the assembly list, she said, because her own daughter had not taken in 3 seasons, because the girl sat against the wall at every ball while the men's eyes went to the composed young widow who did not even want them, because a mother will forgive herself a great deal in the name of a daughter. She confessed that she had told the patronesses the Baroness was not respectable, that she had known it was a lie, that she had watched Eleanor stand alone at the edge of rooms she had been quietly barred from, and had felt a satisfaction she was now ashamed to name. Mr. Pell, the magistrate, was the last of the 6 to break, and his was the quietest and the worst he had known. There was nothing. In the poisoning story, he had read the doctor's account on the first day and seen at once that it was a natural death. He had let the inquiry breathe at the edge of Eleanor's life for a year, because a frightened widow was useful to a man who wished to seem important, because an open question kept the county's eyes on him, because it had cost him nothing to leave a woman under a shadow that he alone could have lifted with a single sentence and had chosen, month after month, not to speak. He said all of this, looking at the tablecloth. And when he had finished, he put his face in his hands. Eleanor sat at the head of her table and watched the people who had spent 3 years trying to destroy her lay themselves open, one by one, and she felt none of the triumph she had imagined on the long nights of making the wine. She had thought, stirring the dark liquid in the still room by candlelight, that this moment would taste of victory. It did not. She felt only a great tiredness, and under it, surprising her, a thread of something close to pity. They were so small, laid bare. Their cruelties had been so ordinary. Not one of them had hated her for anything she had done. They had hated her because she had survived a thing they thought should have broken her, and her survival had been an accusation they could not bear to read, and so they had each, in their separate ways, tried to break what time and grief had failed to break. "Come inside the truth of it," the Duke said. Those were the first words he had spoken all evening, and he said them not to the table but to her, down the long shining length of the oak, and Eleanor's head came up. He had risen from his place at the foot. He stood with one hand resting on the back of his chair, and his untouched glass caught the candlelight in front of him, and he said, his voice level, that he had known what the wine was the moment the widow began to speak, because he had read the same book. She did not understand, and her face must have shown it, because he came toward her then. He crossed half the length of the hall, and stopped a few feet from her chair, and he told her, in front of all of them, the thing he had carried for a year and a half. He had cut her at the Pemberton ball, turned his shoulder in the doorway with the room watching, because his wife had died 4 years before of a fever he had been too proud to believe was serious until it was too late. He had sat by that bed and told himself each evening that she was mending, that a strong young woman did not die of a chill, and he had gone to London on the business that could not wait, and she had been 3 days in the ground before his carriage reached the gates. He had stood in the doorway at the Pemberton ball and felt the whole dangerous warmth of his attention swing toward the Baroness of Harrogate, the one woman in 3 seasons who had made him forget to be careful, and he had been so afraid of caring for another woman whose life he might fail to save that he had turned away from her rather than risk it. The cut had not been contempt. It had been cowardice, and he named it as cowardice. Standing in her hall, with no wine in him to loosen the word, Eleanor's hand had found the back of the chair beside her. She gripped the carved wood until her knuckles ached. She was aware of the warmth at her neck again, the old quickening, and she was aware that her eyes had filled, and that she would not let them spill in front of the 7 people who had come to her table to be unmade. She said that he need not have told her. Not here. Not like this. He said that he knew, and that the difference between him and every other person at the table was that he had not needed the wine to do it, and that this was the only thing he had to offer her that was worth anything at all. His voice did not rise. He had spoken louder commands across a parade ground. She thought distantly, and yet he had never sounded less like a man giving an order. He took one step nearer, close enough that she had to lift her face to hold his eyes, and for a moment his hand moved as though to reach for hers and then stopped, the fingers half open in the air between them, and he let it fall back to his side, rather than touch her in front of the people who had no right to witness it. She understood the restraint and was undone by it more thoroughly than any touch could have managed. The silence that followed was not the silence of confession. It was a softer thing, a held quiet. And into it, Charles Vane said, in the small ruined voice of a man with nothing left to lose, that the magistrate had heard everything, and that the law would have to act now. And Mr. Pell lifted his face from his hands and said that yes, it would. The forged codicil, the raised rents passed the law, the letter to the London bank. 6 confessions made in front of the one man in the county, whose office required him to remember them. Eleanor had not summoned the wine to humiliate them. She had summoned it to make a record, in the one room where a record would hold, because a woman alone could not take 7 well-placed people to law on her word against theirs, not in a county that had already decided what she was, but she could set the truth loose at her own table and let a magistrate hear it fall. And a thing heard by the right ears could not be unheard. She had understood that much from the months of being disbelieved. The word of a lone widow weighed nothing. The word of a lone widow spoken in front of Mr. Bird. Pell, with 5 other confessions ringing in the same air, weighed exactly enough. The night went on a long while after that. The snow that had been falling since the soup had closed the roads, the drifts already past the axle of a carriage wheel, and so the guests could not flee, and Eleanor did the thing that none of them expected, and that she would remember as the truest act of the evening. She did not turn them out into the storm. She had rooms made up, the cold guest chambers aired, and the fires laid. She had the great fires of the hall banked high. She sent the weeping Lady Sutton up with a maid and a warming pan, and she had bread and broth carried to Mrs. Drummond, who could not stop shaking, and she spoke a quiet word to the housekeeper, old Mrs. Hanbaugh. Finch, who had served the Baron 40 years, and had stood by Eleanor through every month of the shadow, and she stood at the foot of the great staircase, and watched her enemies go up to sleep under her roof, undone, and she felt the last of her anger go out of her, like a tide pulling back from a long, flat shore. The Duke remained. The others had gone up, and the candles had burned down to their last third, and the snow came steadily against the tall black windows, and Marcus Thorne sat with Eleanor at the head of the long table that had emptied of everyone who wished her ill. He asked her how long she had planned it. "A season," she said. The flowers had to age in the wine. He asked her whether she had ever meant to drink it herself, to be as honest as she had forced the rest of them to be, and Eleanor was quiet for a moment, turning her own untouched glass by its stem, and then she said that she had thought of it in the worst of the nights, and had decided against it, because a woman who has been called cold for 3 years learns to guard the few true things she has left, and she had not been ready to give hers up to a roomful of people who had never earned them. He understood that. She could see that he understood it, the way his jaw eased and his eyes went grave. He reached across the corner of the table, not quite touching her, his hand stopping a careful inch from hers on the dark oak, and he asked if she would tell him one true thing freely, with no wine in either of them, because he wished to know what it sounded like when she chose it. The fire shifted in the grate and threw a long wave of light up the empty hall. Eleanor looked at his hand, so near and not touching, strong fingers, the plain signet, and she felt the whole long architecture of her guardedness. 3 years of it, the gray gowns and the steady fan, and the composed face in the doorway. And she found that she wanted, for once, to set it down and see what was left of her underneath. She told him that she had known where he stood in every room they had ever shared, that she had carried the awareness of him for 3 years and despised herself for it, and had not been able to stop that even at the Pemberton ball. In the moment he turned his shoulder, her body had known the exact distance between them while her mind tried to call it nothing. That when he had cut her, she had gone home and sat in the dark of her own bedchamber without a candle, and understood that the only verdict she could not survive was his, and had hated him for having that power over her, and had hated herself more for giving it to him freely. No wine required, no compulsion. Only the plain, unbearable fact of having begun to care. She said all of it plainly, the way the wine had made the others speak, except that she was choosing every word. And that was the difference, and they both knew it. Marcus closed the last inch. His hand covered hers on the oak, warm and certain, and she felt her own breath catch and did not hide it. And he did not say anything for a long moment, and when he spoke it was only her name, Eleanor. The first time he had used it, low and careful, like a man setting down something he had been afraid to hold. She turned her hand under his so that their palms met, and the touch ran up her arm like the first warmth of a fire, after a long cold walk, and neither of them moved to make it more than it was because the not yet of it was its own sweetness, and they both understood that what came next could not be unmade and was the better for the waiting. Outside the snow came down on the closed roads in the silent county, and inside the great hall the fire burned, and the two of them sat with their hands joined on the long table where 7 enemies had told the truth, and 1 man had told it first, without being made to. The morning was clear and cold. The snow lay a foot deep over the park and the drive, blue in the early light, and the guests came down one by one to a breakfast they had not expected to be offered, and they ate in a silence that had nothing of the brittle social music of the night before. They were quiet the way people are, quiet after a fever has broken. Mr. Pell spoke to Eleanor before he left, formally in the hall, his hat in his hands, and told her that the matters confessed at her table would go forward through the proper channels, the codicil, the rents, the rest, and that he would be entering his own conduct into the record alongside the others. Because a magistrate who had let a shadow lie on an innocent woman for a year was not fit to judge the men who had cast it. He bowed to her more deeply than he ever had, more deeply than her rank required. The bow of a man making the only amends left to him. The county would hear of it within the week, and it would not be the version of her they had told themselves for 3 years. Charles Vane left without speaking, his face the gray of cold ash. Sir Hugh Crane wrote to the 2 families he had turned off their farms before the month was out, and restored them to their land at the old rent, which Eleanor learned of only later from Mrs. Finch, and which she chose to believe was the wine still working in him, or perhaps something the wine had only uncovered and could not afterward cover again. Lord Farringdon went to 3 clubs, and said in each of them that he had lied about the Baroness of Harrogate out of wounded vanity, and that she was the most honest woman he had ever met, and the saying of it cost him a great deal among men who had enjoyed the lie, and he said it anyway. Thought better of him than she ever had before. Mrs. Drummond she never saw again, and hoped, without much hope, that the woman had found some quiet with the splinter at last drawn out. Lady Sutton restored Eleanor's name to the assembly list and called on her twice that winter and was in time, something not far from a friend, and brought her plain, unmarried daughter, who turned out to have a dry wit and a gift for the pianoforte, and no need at all of the county's verdicts. The Duke of Allerton was the last to leave, and he did not leave at all in the way that mattered. He came back the following week, and the week after that in his own carriage in the cold, bright weather, and he sat with Eleanor in the small, warm parlor where she actually lived, not the great hall built for 60. And they talked the way they had talked that first night, choosing their words, no wine in either of them. He told her about his wife, at last the whole of it, and she told him about the long companionable winters with the old Baron, and neither story frightened the other off. The county watched and revised its verdict. The cold Baroness, it turned out, had not been cold at all. She had been waiting, the way the blue flowers along the south wall waited through the frost for the season that would call them up. They were married in the spring, in the small church at the edge of the Harrogate Park, with the doors open to the green and the few people present who had earned a place there. Mrs. Finch wept in the front pew and pretended it was the cold. Eleanor wore a gown that was not gray, a soft pale green, the color of the new leaves outside the open door. There was no crowd, no assembly, no county arranged in rows to deliver a verdict. Only the people who had chosen her and whom she had chosen back, and the quiet was the warmest thing she had ever stood inside. That winter, the first of their marriage, Marcus found the book. It was in the late Baron's library, the 16th century hand, the receipt for the wine pressed flat between 2 pages, and he brought it to her by the fire and asked whether she meant to keep it. Eleanor took it from him and turned to the page with a tall blue flower drawn in faded ink in the margin, the bishop's veil, the thing that had given her back her name. She looked at it a long while, her thumb resting on the worn edge of the page, where her husband's hand had rested before her. Then she closed the book and set it on the shelf, not hidden and not destroyed, and she said that she would keep it because it had told the truth once when nothing else in the county would. And a thing that has done that ought not to be thrown away. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, the snow was falling again over the closed white roads. The same snow, the same silence, and inside the small, warm room, a woman who had been called cold sat with her husband's arm around her, and the book of true things closed on the shelf above them, and she was, at last, entirely warm. Thank you for staying until the end of Eleanor's table. If her long, patient winter moved you, leave a word below and tell me the moment you would underline.